If you were born somewhere else, you would have been taught a completely different history of the Cold War. The same era, the same events, but two generations of students grew up with two opposing stories. For one side, it was a war to defend freedom, for the other, it was a struggle to survive. The Cold War was not decided only by weapons or treaties, it was decided by who told the story. So what was emphasized, what was left out, and which side were you taught to stand on? Without ever realizing it. Part 1, The Cold War in Western Education. In Western education and history textbooks, the Cold War is often taught as a necessary period of confrontation aimed at preserving freedom and maintaining global order after World War II. The narrative does not begin with a pursuit of power, but with fears of instability and extremism in a world emerging from the devastation of war. According to this perspective, the post-1945 context is presented as a weakened Europe, economically exhausted, socially fractured, and vulnerable to authoritarian ideologies. The United States and its Western allies are portrayed as nations bearing the responsibility of reconstruction and global stabilization. In Western textbooks, the Marshall Plan is described not merely as economic aid, but as evidence of cooperation, recovery, and an effort to prevent the collapse of fragile democracies. Within this same educational framework, the Soviet Union and the expansion of communism are commonly depicted as a systemic threat. Not because of cultural differences, but because communism is presented as a model inclined toward centralized power, restrictions on individual rights, and extensive control over social life. As a result, the Cold War is taught as a defensive response rather than an act of deliberate aggression. The concept of containment lies at the center of Western teaching on the Cold War. Students learn that the objective of the West was not to overthrow the Soviet Union through military force, but to prevent the spread of an ideology believed to threaten individual freedom. The creation of NATO is therefore framed as a defensive alliance designed to deter conflict and ensure that another world war would not occur due to a lack of coordination and collective security. In this narrative, nuclear weapons are presented as a historical paradox. Despite their immense destructive power, they are described as instruments that maintain peace through deterrence. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction is often explained as a key reason the Cold War never escalated into a direct military conflict between major powers. In terms of values, Western education emphasizes the Cold War as a struggle between two social models. One is associated with freedom of speech, elections, and individual choice, the other is portrayed as prioritizing control and stability over political freedom. Within this framework, the West is often positioned as a defender of universal values. While acknowledging that not all actions were flawless or free from controversy, proxy wars such as those in Korea and Vietnam are typically explained in Western education as efforts to prevent the spread of communism, rather than as straightforward wars of invasion. However, many modern curricula have begun to acknowledge the mistakes made, the human cost involved, and the moral complexity of these decisions. The end of the Cold War, from a Western educational perspective, is often presented as a confirmation of the resilience of liberal democracy and market economies. Nevertheless, contemporary approaches increasingly emphasize that the Cold War was not a simple black and white story, but the outcome of fear, belief, and human choice in an uncertain and unstable world. Part 2, The Cold War in Eastern Education. In Eastern education systems, particularly in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, the Cold War is commonly taught as a period of necessary defense in response to pressure and containment from the West following World War II. The narrative does not begin with ideological expansion, but with painful memories of war and invasion. According to this perspective, the Soviet Union emerged from World War II at an enormous cost. Tens of millions of lives were lost, infrastructure was severely damaged, and many cities and industrial regions were destroyed. This historical experience shaped a deep-seated belief that without the creation of security buffer zones, the country could once again become a victim of war originating from the West. In Eastern textbooks, the expansion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe is often presented as a measure to ensure security rather than an act of invasion. Socialist states are described as having chosen a new path in order to avoid a return to the instability, economic crises, and fascism that had previously led to World War. From this viewpoint, the Marshall Plan is not portrayed as purely economic assistance. In Eastern education, it is frequently analyzed as a political tool designed to expand Western influence, bind European nations to capitalist economic systems, and weaken leftist movements. As a result, the Soviet Union's refusal to participate, and its encouragement of allies to do the same, is taught as a decision aimed at protecting sovereignty and political independence. The concept of containment is interpreted very differently in Eastern teaching. Rather than being viewed as a defensive policy, it is often described as a strategy of encirclement. The formation of NATO is presented as evidence that the West neither trusted nor accepted the long-term existence of socialist systems. Within this framework, the Cold War is depicted as an imposed confrontation, in which the East was compelled to respond in order to survive. In military terms, nuclear weapons are not taught as tools of peace, but as a last line of deterrence. The development of the Soviet nuclear arsenal is framed as a necessity to balance power and prevent the West from using military superiority to apply pressure or intervene directly. Ideologically, Eastern education emphasizes the Cold War as a struggle between two social models with different priorities. Socialism is portrayed as a system that places collective interests, social equality, and the right to work above individual gain. Within this narrative, the West is often criticized for economic inequality, neocolonialism, and interference in the internal affairs of other nations. Proxy conflicts such as those in Korea and Vietnam are commonly presented in Eastern teaching as struggles for national liberation, in which revolutionary movements received support to resist imperialist influence. Responsibility for the escalation of these wars is frequently attributed to military interventions by the West. When the Cold War came to an end, Eastern education often framed the collapse of the Soviet Union not simply as the failure of a system, but as the result of accumulated economic pressures, political challenges, and internal mistakes. At the same time, it is taught as a reminder that history is never told from a single perspective, and that no era has only one story. Part 3. The difference is not in the events. When the teaching of the Cold War across different education systems is placed side by side, one clear pattern emerges: the differences rarely lie in the historical events themselves. The major milestones of the period, the formation of opposing alliances, diplomatic crises, and the prolonged arms race, appear in nearly every curriculum. What changes is not what happened, but how those events are placed within a particular framework of meaning. In historical education, events do not exist in a neutral state when separated from interpretation. The same political decision, when framed as containment, is understood as an effort to manage risk in an unstable world. When framed as encirclement, the very same decision takes on the meaning of defensive resistance against external pressure. The facts remain unchanged, the focus of the story does not. This difference is often most visible in the selection of details. Within each education system, certain aspects are emphasized, while others are presented more briefly or positioned as secondary. Such choices do not necessarily indicate concealment, but rather reflect each society's priorities in passing historical lessons to future generations. History, in this sense, is not only a record of the past, but also a tool through which communities come to understand themselves. Language plays a central role in this process. The terms used to describe the same phenomenon can lead to fundamentally different interpretations. An action may be labeled as stabilizing, deterrent, or defensive in one context, and as pressure, intervention, or threat in another. These linguistic choices do not alter the events themselves, but they shape the emotional responses and conceptual frameworks through which learners approach history. It is important to recognize that these differing approaches to teaching often arise from distinct historical experiences. Societies that endured war on their own territory, or faced existential threats, tend to emphasize security and defense. By contrast, societies shaped by different geopolitical positions may focus more on maintaining international order and managing conflict. These differences reflect collective memory rather than deliberate distortion of history. From an educational perspective, this suggests that history is not transmitted as a sequence of absolute truths, but as a process of contextual interpretation. Learners do not simply absorb information, they inherit a way of seeing the world shaped over generations. Differences in teaching, therefore, are not signs of inaccuracy, but expressions of the different questions each society asks of its past. Viewed through this lens, the diversity of Cold War narratives does not weaken historical understanding, it expands it. Comparing different approaches helps learners recognize that history resides not only in what is written, but also in what is emphasized, repeated, and placed at the center of the narrative. It is here that history becomes a tool for developing critical thinking, rather than a collection of fixed conclusions. At a deeper level, the difference lies not in who did what, but in how people interpret the choices made within the specific conditions of their time. This opens the possibility of approaching history as a space for dialogue, where multiple perspectives can coexist without excluding one another. In this approach, the Cold War is not merely a closed chapter of the past, but a powerful example of how interpretations of history continue to shape how we think about the world today. Part 4, Lessons for Today. When we look back at how the Cold War has been taught differently across education systems, the most important lesson is not about deciding which version is correct, but about understanding why these narratives exist in the first place. In this context, history is not merely a record of the past, but an ongoing process of interpretation, closely tied to the experiences, memories, and concerns of each society at different moments in time. For viewers today, this leads to an essential realization: the historical knowledge we receive always carries the imprint of the educational and cultural context in which it was transmitted. Recognizing this does not weaken the value of history. On the contrary, it allows us to approach it with greater awareness. When we understand that the same event can be explained through multiple frameworks, learners gain the opportunity to develop analytical thinking rather than simply memorizing conclusions. Another key lesson lies in the role of language. The way an event is named, the way a decision is described, and the way a period is placed within a broader narrative all influence how we understand the world. This applies not only to history, but also to how information is communicated in the present. The ability to recognize interpretive frames, rather than focusing only on surface-level facts, becomes an essential skill in an increasingly complex media environment. The Cold War also illustrates that many historical decisions were not made under clear or ideal conditions. They were often the result of weighing serious risks in situations marked by uncertainty and prolonged pressure. Understanding this helps viewers avoid simplistic judgments of the past, while opening space for deeper reflection on how people respond to systemic challenges. From an educational perspective, approaching history through multiple teaching frameworks is not meant to relativize truth, but to clarify the nature of historical thinking itself. History does not provide direct instructions for the present, but it offers patterns for understanding how people have confronted fear, power, and responsibility. Through comparison and contrast, learners develop the habit of asking questions rather than searching for ready-made answers. Ultimately, the most enduring lesson of the Cold War may not lie in opposing ideologies, but in how societies attempted to manage tension in a divided world. Viewing the past as a series of choices made under specific conditions allows us to see the present with greater depth, and to be more cautious of overly simple explanations for complex issues. Approached in this way, history does not demand that viewers take sides. It asks only one thing: to slow down, to ask more questions, and to recognize that our understanding can always be expanded. In a world still shaped by different perspectives, this may be the most lasting educational value that history can offer. If the same past can be taught in so many different ways, what makes us believe that the way we understand it now is the only one? And when we look back at the Cold War, perhaps the real question is not who was right, but whether we have truly learned to see the world from more than one perspective.